When I broke that cup, she screamed, "You should have never been born." This happened often, too often, and when she was dying, she prayed out loud for me to forgive her. I came, and I forgave. The cup wasn't even expensive, just some ceramic thing from the dollar store that she'd had for years. I was 8, maybe 9, reaching for cereal on the top shelf when my elbow knocked it off the counter. The sound of it shattering on the kitchen floor still echoes in my head sometimes, all these years later. Not because of the cup itself, but because of what came after. She didn't just yell. She screamed like I'd destroyed something precious, like I'd personally ruined her entire life with that one clumsy movement. Her face turned this deep red color, veins bulging in her neck, and she started shaking. That's when the words came pouring out, words that would become the soundtrack to my childhood. I was a mistake, a burden, a punishment from God for whatever sins she'd committed. She wished I'd never been born, wished she'd lost me before I ever took my first breath. I stood there in my Batman pajamas, barefoot among the ceramic pieces, not understanding why breaking an accident could make someone hate you so much. The cereal scattered across the floor mixed with the broken cup, and I remember thinking I should clean it up, but I was too scared to move, too scared that any movement might make it worse. This wasn't a one-time thing. It became the pattern of our relationship. Spill milk at breakfast, I was worthless. Track mud through the house, I was the worst thing that ever happened to her. Get a B instead of an A on my report card. I was proof that God was punishing her for something. Every normal childhood mistake, every accident, every moment where I wasn't perfect became evidence that I shouldn't exist. She had this way of looking at me sometimes, like she was trying to figure out how her life had gone so wrong. I'd catch her staring when she thought I wasn't paying attention, and there was this expression of pure regret on her face. Not sadness for how she treated me, but regret that I existed at all. It's hard to explain what that does to a kid. You start believing it. You start thinking maybe they're right. The house we lived in was small, cramped, with thin walls that meant there was nowhere to hide when she went off. My room was right next to hers, and I could hear her at night sometimes, talking to herself or praying, asking God why she'd been cursed with such a burden. Other times she'd be on the phone with her sister, complaining about how hard her life was, how she never got a break, how some people just weren't meant to be mothers. School became my escape, but even that was complicated. Teachers would ask about bruises, not from hitting. She was too smart for that. But from the time she'd grab my arm too hard when she was yelling, or push me away when I tried to hug her. I learned to make excuses, to cover up, to act like everything was normal at home. Kids talked about their moms making them lunch or helping with homework, and I'd nod along, pretending I understood what that felt like. I started staying after school as much as possible. Joined every club that would have me, volunteered for extra projects, anything to delay going home. The librarian started giving me odd jobs to do, probably because she could tell I needed somewhere to be. I'd reorganize shelves, help younger kids with reading, clean up the computer area. She never asked why I was always there, just let me exist in that quiet space where nobody yelled or wished I'd never been born. By the time I hit my teens, something had hardened inside me. The constant criticism, the daily reminders that I was unwanted, had created this shell around my heart. I stopped trying to please her because nothing I did was ever good enough anyway. I stopped looking for approval because I learned it wasn't coming. I started making plans to leave the moment I could. The final straw came when I was 16. I'd saved up money from a part-time job at a grocery store, keeping it hidden in my room because I knew she'd find some reason to take it if she found out. I was planning to use it for a car, something that would give me freedom to get away from the house more often. She found the money while snooping through my things, and instead of asking about it, she took it. When I confronted her, she said it was payment for all the trouble I'd caused her over the years, all the food I'd eaten, all the space I'd taken up in her house. That night, I packed everything I owned into 2 garbage bags and left. Didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a note, just walked out the front door and didn't look back. I was scared, had no real plan, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house one more day. A friend from school let me crash on his couch for a while, and I picked up extra shifts at work to pay for a room in a boarding house across town. The freedom was intoxicating at first. Nobody yelling at me for leaving dishes in the sink or not making my bed perfectly. Nobody telling me I was worthless or unwanted. I could come and go as I pleased, eat what I wanted, watch TV without criticism. But underneath all that relief was this deep anger that I didn't know how to handle. Anger at her for treating me like garbage. Anger at myself for believing her for so long. Anger at the whole situation that had robbed me of a normal childhood. Update. I threw myself into building a life that had nothing to do with her. Finished high school while working full-time, which wasn't easy but felt like the most important thing I'd ever done. Every homework assignment completed, every test passed, every day I showed up was proof that I wasn't the failure she'd convinced me I was. My grades weren't perfect, but they were mine, earned through my own effort without anyone telling me I was stupid or worthless. After graduation, I moved to a different state. Wanted to put as much distance as possible between my old life and whatever came next. Got a job at a manufacturing plant. Not glamorous work, but it paid decent money and came with benefits. The other guys there were rough around the edges but treated me fairly. Nobody cared about my family history or where I came from. If you did your job and didn't cause trouble, you were accepted. I rented a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just a one-bedroom place with a tiny kitchen and a view of the parking lot. But it was mine. I remember the first night I slept there, lying on a mattress on the floor because I couldn't afford furniture yet, feeling this incredible sense of peace. No one could tell me I didn't belong there. No one could make me feel unwanted in my own space. Building relationships was harder than I expected. I'd go on dates, meet people at work or around town, but there was always this wall I couldn't tear down. When things got too close, too intimate, I'd find excuses to pull away. The idea of letting someone close enough to hurt me the way she had was terrifying. I'd rather be alone than risk hearing those same words from someone else. There were good moments, though. I discovered I was pretty handy with repairs and started doing odd jobs for neighbors on weekends. There was something satisfying about fixing things that were broken, making them work better than before. An old man down the hall taught me how to change oil in cars, and I started maintaining vehicles for people in the building. These simple acts of helping others, of being useful and appreciated, slowly started to rebuild my sense of self-worth. Years passed without any contact from back home. I wondered sometimes if she ever thought about me, if she regretted how things ended, but I pushed those thoughts away. I was building something new, something better, and looking backward felt dangerous. I changed my phone number, didn't leave forwarding addresses when I moved to better apartments. I wanted to disappear completely from that old life. I started dating someone seriously when I was about 25. She was kind, patient, didn't push when I struggled to open up about my family. We'd been together for almost 2 years when she started talking about meeting my parents. The conversation always made me uncomfortable, and I'd change the subject or make vague excuses about them living far away. She deserved honesty, but I couldn't figure out how to explain that my mother had spent my entire childhood wishing I was dead. The relationship ended, partly because of my inability to be fully open, partly because I still didn't trust that someone could love me without conditions. She tried to understand, but there are only so many walls someone can run into before they give up. After she left, I threw myself even deeper into work and solitary activities. It felt safer to be alone than to risk that kind of pain again. By my early 30s, I built a decent life. Had a good job, a nice apartment, a reliable car, some savings in the bank. I'd proven to myself that I could survive without her, that I could build something worthwhile despite the poisonous foundation she'd given me. But there was still this empty space inside, this unresolved anger that colored everything. I told myself I was fine, that I'd moved on, but the truth was I was still that scared kid standing in the kitchen surrounded by broken ceramic. Update 2. The call came on a Tuesday morning when I was 36. I'd just gotten home from a long shift and was making coffee when the phone rang. The number was from my old area code, which immediately put me on edge. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was a neighbor from the old street, someone whose voice I barely remembered. She was apologetic, said she'd gotten my number from some old records, wasn't sure if she should be calling. My mother was sick, she said. Really sick. Cancer. She'd been asking for me, wanted to see me, but didn't have any way to contact me herself. My first instinct was to hang up. After 20 years of silence, after all the pain and rejection, why should I care what she wanted? I'd built my life without her, proven I could survive and even thrive without her approval or love. The smart thing would be to tell the neighbor I wasn't interested and go on with my day. But something in the way the woman spoke made me pause. She sounded genuinely concerned, not just for my mother but for me too. She said my mother had changed over the years, that she'd seemed different, sadder. That she'd asked about me multiple times, wondered where I was and if I was okay. This didn't match the image I'd carried all these years of someone who was glad to be rid of me. I told the neighbor I'd think about it and hung up. For the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything else. Work became a blur, food tasted like nothing, sleep came in short, restless bursts. I kept thinking about that 8-year-old boy standing in the broken ceramic, wondering what he would want me to do now. Would he want revenge? Would he want closure? Would he want to just keep running? The neighbor called again a week later. My mother was getting worse, she said. The doctors weren't giving her much time. If I was going to come, it should be soon. There was something in her voice, some urgency that made the decision for me. I called in sick to work, threw some clothes in a bag, and started driving toward the town I'd spent 20 years trying to forget. The drive took most of the day, and with every mile, I felt like I was traveling backward through time. Highway signs started looking familiar, then buildings, then entire neighborhoods that held memories I tried to bury. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I had to pull over at a gas station to collect myself, to remind myself that I was an adult now, that I had power and choices she couldn't take away. The house looked smaller than I remembered, more rundown. The paint was peeling, the front yard was overgrown with weeds, and there was a general sense of neglect that made the whole place feel sad and forgotten. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, staring at the front door, trying to work up the courage to knock. This was the place where I'd learned to hate myself, where I'd been told repeatedly that I was unwanted and unloved. Coming back felt like voluntarily walking into a trap. The neighbor who'd called me appeared at her front door, waved me over. She was older now, grayer, but her eyes were kind. She explained that my mother rarely left her bedroom anymore, that she'd been asking for me every day for weeks. The woman seemed genuinely happy that I'd come, kept saying how much it would mean, how my mother had been carrying this burden for so long. I walked up to the front door of my childhood home and knocked. The sound echoed in a way that brought back a flood of memories, coming home from school anxious about what mood she'd be in, tiptoeing through the house trying not to disturb her, leaving through the same door with my life packed in garbage bags. The door opened, and there she was. She looked tiny. The woman who had loomed so large in my childhood, who had seemed like this powerful force of criticism and rejection, was now frail and thin, leaning heavily on a walker. Her hair was mostly gone from the chemotherapy, and her skin had a grayish tint that spoke of serious illness. But her eyes still held that same sharpness, that same intensity one remembered from childhood. We stared at each other for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Neither of us spoke. There was so much history between us, so much pain and anger and regret, that words seemed inadequate. Finally, she stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. The house smelled different, medicine and disinfectant instead of the cooking smells I remembered. Everything was exactly where it had been 20 years ago, like time had stopped when I left. My school pictures were still on the mantel, my report cards still stuck to the refrigerator with magnets. It was unsettling to see these remnants of my childhood preserved like some kind of shrine. She led me slowly to the living room, every step clearly painful for her. We sat on opposite ends of the old couch, the same one where I'd done homework while she watched TV and made cutting remarks about my intelligence. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the things we'd never said to each other. Final update. She couldn't speak well anymore. The cancer had affected her throat, and when she tried to talk, only whispers came out. But she didn't need words to communicate what she was feeling. The regret was written all over her face, in the way she looked at me, in the way her hand shook as she reached for something on the coffee table. It was a Bible, old and worn, with pages marked by years of use. She opened it to a passage she'd bookmarked and pointed to it, then looked at me with eyes that were pleading in a way I'd never seen before. The passage was about forgiveness, about redemption, about the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. Her finger traced the words slowly, and then she looked up at me and started to cry. These weren't the angry tears I remembered from childhood, when she'd cry out of frustration with her life or with me. These were different, full of pain and remorse and something that looked like love. She reached out and touched my hand, and I almost pulled away out of instinct. Her skin was thin and cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. I sat there holding her hand, this woman who had spent my entire childhood telling me I was a mistake, and tried to process what I was feeling. The anger was still there, burning in my chest like it had for 20 years. But there was something else too, pity, maybe, or recognition of shared humanity. She was dying, and she was scared, and she wanted forgiveness from the son she'd spent so many years pushing away. She gestured toward a drawer in the coffee table, and when I opened it, I found letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to me but never sent. The dates went back years, some written just months after I'd left home. I opened one randomly and found words I never thought I'd see from her. Apologies, regrets, expressions of love and pride. She'd written about missing me, about wondering where I was and if I was okay. She'd written about realizing too late how badly she'd treated me, how her own pain and disappointment had turned her into someone she hated. One letter caught my attention because it was recent, dated just a few weeks ago. In it, she wrote about getting sick and facing the possibility of dying without ever making things right between us. She wrote about lying awake at night, remembering all the cruel things she'd said, all the times she'd made me feel unwanted. She wrote about understanding finally that her own pain was no excuse for the way she'd treated an innocent child who had deserved love and protection. As I read, she watched my face, searching for some sign of what I was thinking. When I looked up at her, she tried to speak, managed to whisper a single word. Sorry. It came out broken and barely audible, but it was there. The word I'd waited my whole childhood to hear, finally spoken 20 years too late. But here's the thing that surprised me, it wasn't too late. Sitting there in that living room, holding her hand and reading her letters, I realized that the anger I'd carried for so long was heavier than any burden she'd ever put on me. It had shaped every relationship I'd tried to build, every moment of happiness I tried to embrace. It had made me suspicious of love, afraid of intimacy, convinced that I was fundamentally unworthy of good things. I thought about the life I'd built without her, the person I'd become despite her treatment. I thought about all the times over the years when I'd imagined this moment, when I'd fantasized about her begging for forgiveness and me refusing to give it. I'd pictured myself walking away, leaving her to die with her guilt, finally getting the revenge I'd dreamed of since I was a child. But sitting there, looking at this frail, dying woman who had once been the most powerful and frightening person in my world, I realized that revenge wouldn't heal the wounds she'd left. It wouldn't give me back my childhood or undo the damage that had been done. It would just add more pain to a story that had already had too much. I squeezed her hand and told her I forgave her. The words came out easier than I'd expected, like they'd been waiting inside me all this time. Her eyes filled with tears again, but different tears, relief, gratitude, something that looked like peace. She tried to speak again, managed to whisper thank you, and I could see the weight lifting off her shoulders. We sat together for hours that day, mostly in silence. Sometimes she'd point to old photos or objects around the room, trying to share memories or explanations. Sometimes she'd just hold my hand and look at me like she was trying to memorize my face. I told her about my life, the work I did, the places I'd lived, the person I'd become. She listened with an intensity that suggested she was hearing the most important story ever told. I stayed in town for a week, visiting her every day. Each visit was a little different. Sometimes we'd look through old photo albums. Sometimes I'd read to her from books she'd always loved. Sometimes we'd just sit quietly together. She grew weaker each day, but there was a calmness about her that hadn't been there when I first arrived. The frantic urgency to make things right had been replaced by a peaceful acceptance of what was coming. On my last visit, she was very weak, barely conscious. I sat beside her bed holding her hand, and she opened her eyes one final time to look at me. Without words, I could see everything she wanted to say, that she loved me, that she was sorry, that she was grateful I'd come. I told her I loved her too, and for the first time in my life, I meant it. Not the idealized love of a child for a parent, but the complex, hard-won love of one flawed human being for another. She died 2 days after I returned home. The neighbor called to let me know, said it had been peaceful, that she'd passed in her sleep with a smile on her face. At the funeral, people shared stories about how she'd changed in recent years, how she'd become gentler, more thoughtful, more willing to help others. It was like hearing about a different person, someone I'd never known but wish I had. I don't regret going back. I don't regret forgiving her. Not because she deserved it, but because I did. Because carrying that anger for 20 years had been like carrying a stone in my chest, and putting it down finally allowed me to breathe freely. Because forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from the prison of resentment. The drive home from her funeral was different from the drive there. I wasn't running away anymore, wasn't trying to escape from something. I was just going home, to the life I'd built, to the person I'd become. The past was still there, still part of my story, but it no longer had the power to define my future. I still have those letters she wrote but never sent. Sometimes I read them when I'm struggling with something, when I need to remember that people can change, that it's never too late to try to make things right. They remind me that we're all carrying wounds from our childhoods, all trying to figure out how to be better than the worst things that happened to us. I'm in therapy now, working through the damage that was done and learning how to build healthier relationships. It's slow work, harder than I expected, but worth it. I've started dating again, being more honest about my past and my struggles. It's scary to be vulnerable, but it's the only way to connect with people in a meaningful way. The anger isn't completely gone. I don't think it ever will be. But it's no longer the driving force in my life. I've learned to sit with it when it comes up, to acknowledge it without letting it control me. I've learned that healing isn't about forgetting or pretending things didn't happen. It's about integrating your experiences, the good and the bad, into a story that makes sense and allows you to move forward. My mother was right about one thing. I was a burden to her. But not because I was fundamentally flawed or unworthy of love. I was a burden because she wasn't equipped to handle the responsibility of raising a child, because her own pain and trauma had never been addressed. Understanding this doesn't excuse what she did, but it helps explain it, and that explanation has been part of my healing. I think about her sometimes, especially when I'm facing difficult decisions or challenging situations. I wonder what kind of relationship we might have had if she'd gotten help earlier, if she learned to manage her own pain instead of passing it on to me. But I've made peace with the fact that we'll never know. What we had was what we had, and it was enough in the end. The best revenge, I've learned, isn't making someone pay for what they did to you. It's building a good life despite what they did, becoming someone kind and whole and capable of love. It's breaking the cycle, choosing to be better than the worst things that happened to you. That's the real victory, not over them, but over the damage they left behind.